Well, hello for the closing event of the day. I was giving some topical thoughts and comments to the folks who are going to come up here and join us for this conversation. And after sitting with some of you for lunch, I can say that it was exciting as exciting as it was for me to hear this morning. It was more exciting to hear how you were reacting to what's been going on today. And I think it really is a testament to how everyone came with open minds, candor being the top of the list, to really tackle some conversations that need to be had. And the breakout sessions, I think the ones that I sat through truly were insightful, eye-opening, and I believe that we really are going to get things done. And this is just the step off of where we should be going, to be very frank with you. I want to take a moment now and introduce the folks that we have that'll be joining us in this conversation. And it stems from why we're all here. We're here to eradicate sexual assault, sexual harassment. And what we have here today, ladies and gentlemen, is a bipartisan, bicameral panel assembled because it shows the depth and the breadth of this topic and the commitment of the people who have come down from Washington to share some moments with you and give us their thoughts. It truly is an honor for me to introduce these folks because all three of them are about getting things done. As a member of the Senate Armed Service Committee, and before I actually do the introduction, I'll let you all know, because some people might not know, this is Dr. Wilson, Dr. Esper, and myself. This is our board of directors, members of our board of directors that I'm going to introduce to you. And as a member of the Senate Armed Service Committee, Senator from North Carolina, Senator Thom Tillis, has been a standout voice, a truly standout voice on behalf of our greatest resource, which is the men and women of our uniformed services. From the great state of California, Jackie Speer, Congresswoman Speer, truly has had a laser focus on the issue of personnel for quite some time, to the fact that Newsweek bills her as one of the most fearless women in the world. I want to say in the world yet again. And finally, it's a particular honor to welcome a former Navy midshipman, home here at her old school, Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill. She's been serving all her life, now in the 11th District of New Jersey, but prior to that, she was a fellow Rotorhead, which I don my hat off, being one myself, served over in Europe and the Middle East, and most recently serving when she was still wearing uniform as a Russian policy officer. So now if I could ask my three distinguished guests to join me on the stage, we're going to have some questions and a discussion. What I'd like to do, folks, is just prime a question, and you can take your responses down the line as you would like to. The first question that we generated: how can academic, government, and private sector leaders work together to fight sexual misconduct? And equally important, what can they learn from each other? In fact, we'll start with the midshipman.
Well, I've been introduced as a lot of things, former Navy helicopter pilot, but never former midshipman. That's a first. And I think the last time I was in Mahan was when I had a commandant's call in the 90s, and I just had a unique experience. I went into the ladies' room and there were no urinals, which was great to see. So that's progress. I think, I was just talking to the superintendent about this, and I think something that would be incredibly helpful in fighting this is data, is really understanding what the numbers are, because it's such a hard thing to have good numbers on. I know, a lot of us were sexually harassed when we were in the military or outside of the military, and as a woman who regards herself as very strong and competent, you don't want to report that. You want to handle it yourself. So just getting into an atmosphere where people feel comfortable reporting it, where they understand that there's going to be support, that it is something that they can seek out discussions on and get recourse for is really important. But of course, as we were saying earlier, sometimes when you open up that atmosphere, your numbers actually go up instead of down, and that's a good thing. But you have to have some comparison. You have to be able to compare to, say, other colleges and universities and what's going on there, so you know how much work you have left to do.
So let me start off by saying something very positive about the military academies, because oftentimes I'm not in that position. But I will say that one of the things that I think the universities and colleges around the country can learn from is the fact that there are climate surveys done at each of these institutions on a regular basis. And we can track every 2 years what we're seeing among the midshipmen and cadets in terms of incidents. There is a very extensive participation rate. I think Dr. Van Winkle is here, and she could probably give you the exact number, but the participation rate is very high. I've introduced legislation over a number of years called the HALT Act that would apply to public universities and private universities that receive federal funds, that would mandate that those institutions also do climate surveys, because that is one of the ways that we can start to track this epidemic. And it is an epidemic. It's an epidemic, as you know, in the college environment everywhere. I think we feel in part because the military cadets and midshipmen are the best and the brightest and hopefully the most disciplined, that somehow they're a step above. But the truth of the matter is, it's pretty widespread. We all know that alcohol is a significant component, but it's no excuse for not fixing the problem.
First, I want to welcome, I was happy to go through the program and see the great representation of North Carolina institutions here, so I'm glad you're here. I think that touching on the point of data, we've got to measure progress over time. And here's what you don't do if you're a service academy head. You don't tell me that our incidences are below the national average, because I want our incidences in the service academies to be 0 and set the standard for every other university to follow. Having said that, going through the program, I was impressed. By the way, a lot of you who've spoke on panels or presented today will most likely be getting a call, because there's some extraordinary information in here. This one program, I think, was from, the speaker was from University of Windsor, where we already see a metric where programs have had a dramatic impact, I think a 50% impact in reported assaults. We've got to figure out the best possible programs. We've got to find the working models that have already proven themselves and scale them. And also, I think, as Congresswoman said, the congressman or congresswoman always?
Woman. We are women.
Well, I always get confused.
Or representative.
Because Virginia Fox says congressman. So I think it's important for us to have metrics that matter, that we can put into place very quickly and be very aggressive about it.
So, Congresswoman and Senator, you are legislators. You oversee our institutions, not only the educational institutions, but the body of uniformed members. What would be your priorities, if you could frame them up, with respect to prevention of sexual misconduct?
Well, I think we have the sexual assault issue, I think, before both of our Armed Services Committee, and I chair the Personnel Subcommittee. So what we want to do is, on the one hand, get a lot better at prosecuting cases of sexual assault, but I want that to be the remedy really is trying to do prevention. And I think it starts with always assessing our culture and, again, putting these programs into place where we just end the shameless pipeline of sexual assault cases in our service academies. And then we have to work on a prosecutorial framework that we all think is fair, that on the back end will maybe to a certain extent contribute to prevention, but there's so much that we can do in terms of climate, in terms of reporting, in terms of sharing information so that we can let bad actors know that they're going to get our radar very quickly.
I think if I can convey one message to all of you, it is to believe the victim. 92 to 98% of those that report are telling the truth. And we somehow have allowed either misinformation or commentary to allow us to think that maybe they're lying. I mean, it is an extraordinary number that they are telling the truth. And the vast majority of assault victims don't come forward. And they don't come forward for one reason, because they don't believe the system will work for them, and they're fearful of retaliation. And what we see with the cadets and in military service is retaliation is a huge problem. So I have looked at both the systems, and it's interesting because they're private entities, they're private systems. You have a uniform code of military justice for the academies, and you have a code of conduct for the universities and colleges. And there's this expectation that through those systems, we are going to be able to somehow mete out a level of justice for all. And what we find oftentimes is that justice doesn't get done. And it's in part, I think, due to not having enough resources or not taking into account the importance of the victim. I've been on college campuses. I know UC is not here, and I regret that UC campuses are not here, all 14 of them. But I remember sitting at a bench with a young co-ed at UC Berkeley who was sexually assaulted. She reported it. She was never interviewed, and she was never told what the result was. I mean, that's unconscionable. I've talked to cadets who have wanted nothing more but to be transferred to another academy. And that, at that time, wasn't available. We're looking at, I think, legislation this year that would make that appropriate. And I've talked to all three superintendents, and thank you all for being here. I really think it's important that you are here. That we find some means by which the victim is truly made whole again.
Well, first of all, thank you, Congressman Spears, for all the work you've done in this area. It's hard work. These are stories that not only are hard to tell, but that people don't always want to hear because they're difficult, and it's difficult to always know the path forward and the way forward. And I know that your work has not always been welcomed in Congress and your oversight, so thank you for really doing that and drawing attention to some of the issues in this field. It's, you know, I would say culture would be the #1 thing we have to attack. Some of how I think we do that is through data and understanding of it, but we see alcohol is certainly a problem, but culture can be an even worse overarching problem, and I saw it myself. When I entered the Naval Academy, and certainly this is very dated, very, very dated now, it's been a while, but when I entered, people came from across the country, and many of them came from high schools like mine. There were some people from all male or all female high schools, but mostly regular high schools. There was not a misogynistic bent to the entering freshman class, but over time, after reading James Webb's Women Can't Fight articles from Proceedings magazine, after having a woman stand up at an all-hands call to ask when women would be on submarines, and the CNO of the Navy saying, "Not in my lifetime," to a standing ovation. These sorts of things break down your culture. And I'll tell you, when I served under a commanding officer that cared very much about everyone serving well and everyone's service being really applauded and making sure that the squadron was going to thrive, that worked out very well. When I served under a commanding officer who would say things, you know, derogatory towards women, or, oh, gosh, you know, that one has to do this, or what have you, things didn't go very well. And so I think culture is incredibly important, and the way I think we address that is through data, is through making sure we have these climate surveys, but also through making sure that the reporting process is not so internal. And we have this problem in the military where where the stories aren't heard or the women aren't believed. You know, oftentimes it happens that not just in the military but throughout business, women make a report of some sort of unwanted sexual advances. Often, like I said, this isn't something that, you know, a woman wants to come forward and talk about because you feel like you should be able to handle it. So you mention it, you talk about it, and then you tell somebody, your boss, but then you don't talk about it much more. It's not something you go to the lunchroom and say, you know what, I was sexually harassed and it was horrible, and oh my gosh, you know, this happened, this happened, this happened. You pretty much, you tell your story, you try to get it handled, and that's it. Whereas the male, often the male, sometimes it's vice versa, but who is reported, they'll tell their story left and right. Oh my gosh, you know, she just said that because she was in love with me, and I told her I wasn't going to go out with her, and this is just her retaliation, and you know, she said this, and you know, this is how it really happened, and they'll talk, and until the point where, you know, sometimes the workforce will turn against the woman who's reported that conduct. So these are the kind of things you have to make sure to root out of your organization. You have to have the reporting regime so that this doesn't happen, so that you know, people who are reporting sexual assault, sexual harassment are supported in doing that. And I think we're making great strides towards that. I certainly have heard through numerous people that that the Academy now, which, you know, I love the Naval Academy, but I'm glad to report it's not the Naval Academy I attended. And I mean that in the best possible way. I think we need to keep moving forward in that direction.
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's so rare that one of us service secretaries get to ask the representatives question. I
haven't been uncomfortable with that.
Payback is hell.
Well, let me throw one out there. We had a fascinating conversation this morning. I believe it was Jackson Katz who brought up some very interesting aspects. But one of the ones that he brought up was, and this addresses the culture, because we all agreed, it seemed we all had an agreement that whether an American college, university, or academy, we take every year a slice of what society gives us. And one of the things he brought up as an example was the corrosive nature of pornography and what that does culturally to us as a country. You as legislators, how would you react, or what would be your observations on what is happening culturally, and can anything be done to it or affect it from your point of view?
This reminds me of a comment that one military officer said in terms of dealing with this issue at one point, and says, well, it's just the hookup culture today. That's why we have this. I think it's a huge mistake to somehow excuse this kind of conduct on any level. So I think that what we need to do is make sure that we create training and prevention programs that young people will respect, that we hold people accountable, and that we develop the kind of expertise in the investigative function and in the prosecution of these cases, so that we're going to have the fairest jurisdictional action taken. But I'm not one to somehow suggest that because you've got you know, the readiness, availability of pornography, that is somehow creating an environment that makes this more prevalent. I think that for whatever reasons that we are dealing with this issue, we've got to fix it. Because what we oftentimes don't appreciate is the scarring that happens to the victim is lifelong. It is not just you know, a one and done experience. It is something that oftentimes has a profound effect on them.
You know, I think as a matter of public policy, pornography, alcohol, other factors that are clearly linked to some of these behaviors. We have to figure out how to deal with it. With respect to free speech issues, there's very little that we as congressional members can do, but it doesn't mean that you can't somehow have in your code of conduct in all your universities and service academies some things that are just the price of admission policies, but I think they will have to be at the policy level, not rise to the level of congressional action, no matter how much we would like to do it because of the constraints that we have on ourselves. But, you know, one thing I have thought about that I'm going to do as a part of my my next class of nominations for service academies, and that is going to be at the point of application, creating that culture at the point in time that we have these brilliant young men and women applying to go to a service academy. I think it starts there. We should indoctrinate them very early on about our expectations when we're putting them forward. I track my service academy nominees through their process. We keep track of them. And I think a part of what we can do as members of Congress, we all have our service academy nominations. We all take them through things. Probably none of us have ever thought about having some focus in our orientation on these being issues that are very important to us. And we're watching you. For as long as I'm a U.S. Senator, I'm watching the progress of these young, brilliant future leaders and help actually at that early stage in the process establish a culture that has frank discussions about these things.
You know, I come at this from two sides. The first side is that the idea that we need data. If there is a link between the pornography in our culture that's widely available and people having views about you know, consent and sex, and we need to address that, then we need to come up with training programs that are going to address that. I don't think, I've not seen the data on that, so I can't say that I know whether or not that's an issue driving anything. Certainly it's never an excuse. Never be able to say, well, you know, I watch a lot of pornography, so that's why I had to assault this woman. But if there is some linkage between what children see at a young age and not having a great sense of right and wrong with respect to consent, then we certainly need to have this, you know, some data on that and study it and make sure we're addressing it correctly. That said, I will say that as a mother of young children, it is pernicious. You know, there were probably as I was growing up, a 10 or 11-year-old, the most they might have seen is, you know, women in bras in the Sears catalog. Now, my 13 and 11-year-old have seen horrific things on the internet, and it's and just about every parent can tell you that. And you know, short of just giving them a flip phone, which I've thought about, it's really, really scary, and it's not limited to that. I mean, there are horrible things on the internet that you know are constantly trying to guard against, constantly trying to put programs on your children's viewing that can, you know, kind of keep them safe. That said, I was just talking to someone from the FCC 2 days ago, I think, and she said, you know, they have no regulatory power over YouTube, or some of the videos that are put out are simply completely unregulated. So what that should and will look like in the future, it's something we're struggling with now because this is kind of a brave new world.
Can I add one thing?
Certainly.
Certainly for the academies, and I'm sure for the universities as well, you evaluate these applicants in terms of academic excellence, in terms of athletic ability, in some cases, and leadership. We might need to be adding a fourth component about moral fitness. I don't know how we would measure it, but maybe there needs to be yet another component in assessing
And it's a
this.
mission of the Academy, morally, mentally, and physically. I think that's a great point.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor, so start thinking about your questions. For the three of you, if you could share with us, realizing what the conference is here about, what you have learned about this topic, and what, as a legislator in your position, would be your insights and/or guiding comments for us going forward?
Well, I think one thing, I know Senator McSally, I believe, gave the keynote here this morning, and my focus as the chair of the Personnel Subcommittee is bringing forward courageous people like Martha McSally and Joni Ernst and others to work in collaboration to have the tough subjects. Secretary, you said that what you were struck most by in this session and what some of the attendees were struck by was the candid conversations that you had today. We need to continue to have those candid conversations in committee hearings and candid conversations amongst ourselves where we all want the same end result. We may have differences in terms of, as a matter of public policy, how we do that, but we've got to really double down on it. And we've had hearings, and we will have additional hearings working with Senator Gillibrand, Senator McSally on the Personnel Subcommittee. We've got to make sure also that the leaders, the commanders who have input are also bringing forth good ideas, but also giving us the feedback we need when they think that that well-intentioned policies moving forward may be problematic. We've got to make sure that we push that. And the only other thing, and I think it relates to one of the opening comments here, the thing that drives me crazy about the men and women in uniform who come before our committees is they always have a can-do attitude to everything that we're proposing, even when they don't think it's a good idea. We'll make it work. And I don't know how we break that. I think in some cases it may be the very reason why some victims do not come forward, because they think they've got to make the best of a bad situation versus understanding it's in our collective best interest for them to come forward. So candor, a lot of information, more data for us to have well-informed public policy decisions in a short interval. This isn't something I want to declare victory on 5 years from now. This is something that I want to make measurable progress in this Congress, and I love the fact that you referred to data along the way. It's got to be driven by the facts, and it's got to be measurable, and we have to make sure that we put the infrastructure in place to measure progress over time, credit those who are making measurable progress, and go after those who aren't.
So I would say that, we do have data as it relates to the academy. We have seen an increase in assaults, and we've seen an increase in sexual harassment. One of the most jarring statistics for me is that 50% of the cadets and midshipmen in our academies have reported sexual harassment. The number of sexual assaults, I believe it's at the military academy, correct me if I'm wrong, Superintendent, in 2 years has gone up 50%. Now, in part, some of this could be due to more willing to report, but whether it's at the military academies or it's at the university setting, it's a problem that we have not unlocked the solution to. And the rolling of the eyes that I hear about in terms of the training that goes on, oh, we've got to go through this again, it is not connecting with the students. We do see a difference between the college campuses, the really vulnerable times at college campuses, and many of you who are in private universities can speak to this, is that orientation period, is that period from September, October through December of a freshman year, or at the end of their college years and their senior years. What we see at the academies is that it's not happening when they're plebes. It's happening when they're in their second year. That's when you see a greater incidence of sexual assault in particular. And it's when you start to loosen, I guess, the kind of control. The other thing that we found in the data that we have been collecting is they're starting, and Dr. Van Winkle can speak to this, the concern we have now is that there's a backlash happening. And this is something that we've all got to deal with, that as the number of women are increasing in our academies, and the numbers are remarkable, and the leadership roles that many of these women have as first in their classes is pretty remarkable too. But what we're seeing is that there's a backlash against women, which from an academy standpoint, we've got a nip in the bud. Probably not as much of an issue at the private university.
I think what the senator said and what the congressman said, you know, you both made some great points. I do think I would just add to that the reporting, how it's reported, making sure that the midshipmen have a place to go outside the chain of command or outside the brigade of midshipmen, and making sure that as we go even, you know, greater into our actual services, making sure that the reporting and the investigations don't simply happen. Sometimes it's just far too insular and far too easy for people to cover it up or to suggest that people might not want to report it or then face backlash should they report it.
So I open the floor to any questions. The microphones are at the end of the aisles here, and as you come up to ask a question, because you have a unique a panel up here, which you don't get to ask questions of too often, I would like to just share with our panel mates that one of the things that the three service secretaries, when we put this convivium together, was to put a commitment amongst all the participants here, and hopefully everyone will join us, or clearly a majority, which is to share data and to share best practices and to make a commitment, this being the first of an ongoing set of conviviums that we'll hold, to work towards interaction amongst each other. With that, I'll open the floor.
All right. I'm a little short for this microphone. Rape prevention programming and response services rely heavily on the Violence Against Women Act, which expired about 4 months ago at this point and is currently waiting to be reauthorized. So I would like to know what each of you is doing to get this important legislation reauthorized.
You want to go?
Well, the good news is that the House passed the VAWA reauthorization today. Yeah, no, I'm a co-sponsor.
Yeah, we both co-sponsored it.
Of it. And Senator, you're going to hear this as you contemplate it. One of the elements, it's not just a blanket reauthorization. Some would like to just see it reauthorized in its previous forms. It's never been a political issue. It's always been bipartisan. It's been renewed 3 times. But we want to improve it. And so one of the areas is where someone has been convicted of domestic violence or stalking or an intimate relationship with someone where there's violence, that we would be authorized to take the guns away from them. That is, it's pretty common sense, but it does not have the support of the NRA, and so that's a battle that is going to have to be fought. One of the provisions that I got into VAWA, that was a bill I had introduced, really came from an experience in New York where I read that a police officer had sex with someone who was in his custody and handcuffed. And he got off because there was the ability to argue consent. So we now have language in the measure that will relate to federal officers and an incentive for states. Some 30 states don't have a provision to prevent the defense of consent to be not allowed. And so we're going to try and create incentives for them to pass that legislation by having them access more VAWA funds. But it's another component that we've put in to try and make sure that when people of authority have extraordinary power over someone else, you can't argue that there is consent. And so and that happens in any number of settings. I mean, I've worked on it with in the academic world, where you have teaching assistants at the graduate level who become sexually harassed and assaulted by their advisors, and there is a very difficult relationship there, because your advisor is the one who's going to give you a recommendation or help you get the grant money. So whenever there's a disproportionate relationship, it speaks to a problem that we've got to address.
Well, I'm on the Judiciary Committee. I would assume if that's moving out of the House, that's something that Senator Grassley will take up. I have, as Speaker of the House back in North Carolina, we took up a number of measures over 4 years that had to do with sexual assault, had to do with human trafficking, and a number of other matters that I thought that we were able to do on a bipartisan basis. I hope that we're able to do the same thing here.
Good afternoon. My name's Katie Conlin. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins and an alumna from UC Berkeley, actually, for the record. You are represented. I have two short questions that I kind of would like to see what your opinion is. The first being, do you think that there's a way to change the way we talk about accusations? Because the way we have these conversations, particularly in the media, we list the accolades of the accused and talk about this person with all this authority and all of this success was accused of X, Y, or Z. And the way we form that, it's almost like you have to attack this person's success before you can talk about what the issue actually is. Like the fact that when we hear about a gold medal winner swimmer at Stanford sexually assaulting someone, we talk about his swimming record and not what this individual is accused of doing. And I think that's incredibly problematic, and also becomes a further barrier for someone to want to accuse someone who is in a position of power via direct power, professionally, or status in some capacity. My other question is, we put all these efforts into investigating individuals, but then is there a way to generate communication between groups besides just data, such that if someone is found guilty of something, they can't just switch to a different university or switch to the private sector or switch to some other organization and not have that finding kind of follow them, or at least not follow them, but let the new institution be aware of what this person has been found guilty of? Is there a way to open up that communication?
Well, I'll cover the second question. I know that the Department of Defense is working on standing up an information sharing tool among the department. We know, I can't remember the name of the off-the-shelf product that some universities have implemented that let people share information. The sad fact, Callisto. The sad fact about sexual assault is that it's very seldom only done once by the perpetrator. It's done often or frequently. It is multiple times. And you're right, they could serve from one jurisdiction to the other. So as we start standing up this capability to at least communicate within a university or university system, I think that we ultimately need to scale it so that there's really no place to hide or no place to run. And I believe that once we get capability stood up within the lines of service, that we have to look at how we interconnect. And obviously there's got to be governance. One thing I will tell you about the accused, not the specific point that you made, which I think is a very, very important one, but we're trying to collect information from other countries as a result of a recent committee meeting that we had with subject matter experts. We want to go out and be instructed by policies that we're trying to balance we have to balance the rights of the victim and the accused. And we've got to figure out how to do that, and hopefully some of our policy proposals will be instructed by what has worked and what's had to be adjusted with some of these other nations that quite honestly are ahead of us on protecting the rights of the accuser.
Yes, you know, as far as the first part, I certainly dealt with sexual harassment myself. I knew other women who were sexually assaulted, but I have been shocked at the stories coming out and the breadth of stories coming out in the past few years. It has just really taken me aback, and I feel of all people, if I'm shocked, who wouldn't be? Because I felt like I, of all people, should have known what was going on in our society in a deeper way and in a better way. So I think we're learning how to deal with this. We are caught flat-footed when we're dealing with it in the court of public opinion, when we don't have the ability to weigh the evidence or to weigh the testimony as we would in a court of law. I'm a former federal prosecutor, and unfortunately, that has been what we've been doing, and I think we've really been suffering for it. And I think, you know, as women, we feel so troubled that we see professional women and we kind of think there, but for the grace of God, you know, is some woman coming forward and telling her story, which I think many of us believe in the stories, but still don't feel, even if we believe what they're saying, that we have the correct ability to weigh that evidence, and we don't have the ability to hear from the person that's being accused, and they're not giving a fair chance to discuss that, and it feels like a very bad system or a very bad way to weigh the evidence. So to the extent that we can handle a lot of these accusations and come up with a plan to get them out of sort of the court of public opinion and into our court system or into some other way of arbitrating that would, I think, be much better.
So one of the problems we have is that, let's just take the military for instance. There are about 15,000 cases a year of sexual assault in the military. They happen mostly to men because there are more men in the military, obviously, than women. But of those 15,000, only 5,000 of them report. We've got already 2/3 of the people not reporting because they fear the system won't do justice. And of the 5,000, about 500 go to court-martial. And of the 500 that go to court-martial, only 250 end up conviction. So if you look at those numbers, it makes me want to look at our Uniform Code of Military Justice. See, what do we have to do to make this right? Now, one of the things we need to do, which we haven't done yet, and hopefully we can do this year in the NDAA, is deal with the issue that those who are convicted, at 250, that should be on the sex offender list. That information is not necessarily shared with states. Some states it is, some states it's not. States get a Article 15 conviction. They don't know what that is, and they can't make sense of it. So I think what we need to do is create an actual sex offender list within the military that states can access, so they'll be able to identify persons who have actually been put on that list. As it relates to academia, we are attempting to address the issue of the sexual harasser or assaulter who's a professor who then is found to have sexually assaulted or harassed and then goes to another institution, by having them disclose if they have had a determination that they have sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, so it could limit their grant money that they.
Thank you. So I appreciate all of you recognizing this issue as an epidemic. I would agree with that, having worked in law enforcement and now on a college campus. And I appreciate the support for getting this right and doing better on college campuses and at the academies. And as a result of the legislation and the support and the resources that are being poured into the process on college campuses, things are getting better. Reports are going up, students are getting better services, and those who are responsible for the response and education are being educated themselves. So investigators who are responding to these reports on college campuses are required to get trauma-informed training.
It's really important.
Right. And this is great for those women and men who are privileged enough to go to college and to go to the academies. But this is an epidemic that's affecting everyone in this country. And so my question is, when are we going to turn our resources and our attention to law enforcement and their response, and to making sure that they're required to get training on how to appropriately respond to this very special type of criminal act, to the trauma that's involved? When are we going to start to focus on that? Because I can tell you, I have students come to me, they're reporting, and they're going through the process, and perpetrators are being held accountable where appropriate. Those same students are going to law enforcement. And within a moment, they're either leaving the station because they don't feel believed by the responding officers, or if they are, the prosecutors are declining to prosecute. And I don't think it's because they don't care. I think it's because police, law enforcement generally, prosecutors generally, are not getting the training that they need to really understand these issues. I didn't understand it when I started. And then I went to higher ed, and now I regret half the decisions I made as a prosecutor. When are we going to turn our lens there?
You know, that's a great question, and unfortunately it's piecemeal across the country. We have certain prosecutors' offices that handle it quite well and others that don't. And I think we do need to look more carefully at addressing this. Again, I think now is the time when it is coming to the forefront of in so many people's minds, and something that I think we would like to look at.
You know, I would also say that you raise a very important point, that we have not spent much time, whether it's at the academies, in the military, or in civilian society, in terms of training people to understand how to inquire from a trauma victim what their issues are. I know when we had some training within the military for a period of time, the question that kept being asked was, well, why didn't you say no? Why didn't you scream? And you have to appreciate that when you're being raped, the fear factor can be so great that all you want it to do is for it to end, and so you don't say anything. So being well educated is a really important component. I also think that we should mandate that there be rape kits on every college campus, and that we have sane nurses that can provide the proper extraction of the detail. Because the humiliation that a woman goes through when she has to travel 30 or 40 miles to get to a hospital to have a rape kit done is, you know, it adds just so much more pain to the experience. We had a hearing this week where 3 service members testified about their recent experience of sexual assault in the military. And I asked them a question: was the process that you endured after the sexual assault worse than the rape? And each one of them said yes.
I think one thing, when we're looking at the subject of today and tomorrow's sessions, that first off, we want to be laser focused on the challenge that brought everybody into the room. Yours points to a bigger problem that we need to address, and I think we have to take it in layers. When I think if you've been in law enforcement, you may be familiar with the CALEA program and certain certifications that law enforcement agencies receive that can have an impact on their eligibility for grants and other funding. A part of what we probably need to do is go back and determine the extent to which those certifications have an emphasis on this, have subject matter experts, and build from the ground up there, so that those are things that we can do immediately. They're relatively easy lifts while we go about attacking this challenge ahead of us, and there's so much more to do.
I don't want to disadvantage anyone in the upper lobes up there, so if anyone has a question, please stand up, and I'm more than happy to recognize you. Just have to use your command voice. It looks like we're coming to an end, but before we do, I just wanted to, I'm going to call her out. She's not expecting this, but Dr. Van Winkle, if you could stand up and just identify yourself, because here is the person who is the primary coordinator and our data meister at the Department of Defense. And for all of you, when we talk about sharing data, we have our data is already up, public, and available, but Dr. Van Winkle really is a contact point for you. And if you want to say a couple of words, Doctor, I'm going to put you on the spot.
I would just reiterate what was said, that I think one of our greatest strengths is the data that we have. I come from a place, Kenyon College graduate, I believe Kenyon's here. Here we go. Where I learned early on that it is impossible to make decisions in this space unless you know what's going on. And it's hard to know what's going on. And I say that having gone through a few testimonies. Nice to be on this side.
And you did well.
Thank you. And I don't like what we find every year. But the fact that we have the information, we know what's happening, is our greatest strength. And that transparency is our greatest strength. And it's not to say that we look to compare ourselves with anybody else. We don't. We have higher expectations for ourselves. But we are all in this together, and it's a challenge that I've seen in the civilian sector when I worked there and in the military as I work here. And so I really do just echo what was said about the importance of understanding what is happening on your campuses, what is happening at our academies, and what's happening in our force, so we can make better decisions in this space. I certainly would welcome anyone to contact me. We are always open with our data. It's publicly available. If you ever have any issues with it, contact me personally.
Thank you very much. Well, if there's no more questions, to the panel members, on behalf of Drs. Esper, Wilson, and myself, thank you very much for your participation in this. It shows the dedication to this problem, and we're going to solve it. For the crowd, thank you for your questions. We're adjourned, and I gather the next, I look to you, Melissa, we're off to a no-host social, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to let you take command. But thank you all very much, and thank you, panel members.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the formal portion of Day 1's events. We will transition to a no-host social at Dahlgren Hall. I want to thank you so much for being willing to engage in this national discussion. We will have guides taking you to Dahlgren Hall, and there is also a president's dinner at the Buchanan House, and we will escort the presidents to the universities. Thank you.